Okay, listen to me very carefully. If I don't make it out of this room in the next 5 minutes, tell my landlord he can keep the security deposit. I'm currently squeezed inside a laundry chute. Yes, a chute. Why? Because I thought it would be funny to replace the Alpha King's body wash with bubblegum-scented shampoo. It was funny, until he walked into the bathroom, while I was still holding the bottle. I can hear the water running. I can hear him humming. And I can hear, oh God, I can hear him sniffing the air. He smells the bubblegum. He smells me. He just stopped humming. He's coming toward the chute. He knows I'm in here. And judging by the growl vibrating through the wall, he's not looking for a towel. He's looking for a snack. If your heart just skipped a beat, you are exactly where you belong. Welcome back to Storm's Werewolf Romance Library, the only place on YouTube where bad decisions lead to the best kind of trouble. If you're ready to see how how Sienna talks her way out of this one, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Consider it your safety line. And for those of you who want the unedited, too hot for the public version of what happens in that bathroom, join the channel membership. Drop a comment below and tell me, what's the worst place you've ever hidden to avoid getting caught? Let's compare notes, now. Shh. He's opening the door. Chapter 1. The Janitor of Silver Peak Academy. There is a specific rhythm to disappearing, a cadence to making yourself so small that the world simply forgets to look at you. I had perfected it over the last 6 months, trading the silk and violence of my father's court for the gray polyester uniform of a Silver Peak Academy cleaner. Most wolves here saw the mop in my hand and assumed I was born to hold it, that I was nothing more than a beta female with weak blood and no prospects. They didn't know that the hands scrubbing the scuff marks off their marble floors could snap a man's wrist before he even registered the threat. They saw a janitor, a ghost in the hallways of the elite, and I let them. Being overlooked was better than being hunted. The hallway smelled of industrial lemon cleaner and the lingering metallic tang of teenage hormones. It was late, the sun dipping below the jagged horizon, casting long bruised shadows across the lockers. I should have been done an hour ago. But the varsity pack had decided to track Mud through the West Wing after practice, and Mud didn't clean itself. I dipped the mop into the gray water, the muscles in my back protesting the repetitive motion. It was a good pain, though. It was a simple pain. It grounded me in a reality where my biggest problem was a stubborn stain, not a warlord father tearing apart the continent to find his runaway heir. I squeezed the handle tight, focusing on the mundane squeak of rubber against tile, letting the meditative work silence the wolf pacing restlessly in the back of my mind. But silence never lasted long at Silver Peak. Heavy footsteps echoed around the corner, followed by the distinctive sneering laughter that made my stomach turn. Braden and Jessa. They were highborns, spoiled heirs to minor packs who treated cruelty like a competitive sport. I didn't look up, keeping my gaze fixed on the suds swirling around my boots, hoping my scent-masking lotion was still holding strong. If they smelled even a hint of the storm that brewed in my blood, the game would be over. A heavy boot slammed into my bucket. The sound was deafening in the empty hall, a sharp crack of plastic against stone. Gray water sloshed out, soaking the hem of my pants and pooling across the floor I had just dried. I froze, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline, forcing my posture to slump, forcing my chin to tuck against my chest. I had to be the mouse. I had to be the prey. Jessa giggled, a sharp grating sound. She stepped closer, her heels clicking on the wet floor, stopping just inches from my face. She smelled of expensive perfume and rot. She leaned in, her voice dripping with mock sympathy that was far sharper than any growl. She asked if I was going to cry, mocking the mess I had made, acting as if kicking the bucket over had been an accident of fate rather than her own malice. My wolf snarled internally, urging me to grab her by the throat, to show her exactly what kind of monster was hiding beneath the polyester. I swallowed the rage, tasting copper, and whispered a trembling apology. Braden wasn't interested in apologies. He moved behind me, his presence heavy and suffocating. He grabbed the back of my collar, his fingers digging into the nape of my neck. Panic, cold and electric, spiked through my veins. It wasn't the fear of him hurting me. I could take him apart in 3 seconds flat. It was the fear of losing control. And the fabric of my uniform was cheap and worn thin from too many washes. As he yanked me backward toward the lockers, the material gave way with a sickening rip. Cool air hit the skin of my shoulder, exposing the scars I kept hidden. The silver lines that mapped out a history of violence I was trying to outrun. Braden laughed, shoving me hard against the metal lockers. The impact rattled my teeth, but I didn't fight back. I couldn't. I slid down the metal until I hit the floor, pulling my knees to my chest, squeezing my eyes shut. I waited for the blow. I waited for the pain that I deserved for being weak enough to hide. But the blow never came. Instead, the air in the hallway vanished. It was sucked out in a single terrifying instant, replaced by a pressure so immense it felt like gravity had just increased tenfold. But the fine hairs on my arms stood up. A scent rolled over me, crashing like a tidal wave. Dark rain, crushed cedar, and raw, unbridled power. It was the scent of a predator that ate other predators. The heavy double doors at the end of the hall didn't just open, they were obliterated. Wood splintered and hinges screamed as they were torn from the frame by an unseen force. Braden and Jessa froze, their cruelty evaporating into pure, primal terror. I looked up through my lashes, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Standing in the ruined doorway, silhouetted by the dying light, was a monster in a bespoke suit. His eyes burned with a golden fury that promised death, and they were fixed entirely on me. Chapter 2. The King's Wrath. The silence that followed the destruction of the doors was absolute, but in a vacuum where sound used to exist. Braden, who had been seconds away from breaking my nose, dropped me as if my uniform had suddenly caught fire. He scrambled back, his boots slipping on the wet tile I had just mopped, crashing into the lockers with a clang that echoed like a gunshot. I didn't move. I stayed huddled on the floor, my knees pulled to my chest, trying to make myself look like the terrified little mouse they all thought I was. It wasn't entirely an act. The power rolling off the man in the doorway wasn't just authority. It was a physical weight, heavier than gravity, pressing down on my lungs until every breath felt like a labor. This was an Alpha Prime. This was Damon, the king of the Northern Territory. And he looked ready to burn the entire academy to the ground just to warm his hands. He stepped into the hallway, the ruined doors groaning in his wake. He didn't shout. He didn't roar. He simply walked toward us with a predatory grace that made the linoleum floor feel like a kill zone. His eyes, molten gold and terrifyingly intelligent, swept over Braden and Jessa. They both whimpered, dropping to their knees and baring their necks in immediate, pathetic submission. I watched through the curtain of my hair, my own wolf pacing agitatedly in my mind. She wanted to challenge him. She wanted to stand up, flare my aura, and meet his gaze with the defiance of a warlord's daughter. "Stay down," I commanded her. "If he sees us, he hunts us." Damon stopped inches from where I sat. I expected him to kick me out of the way, or perhaps ignore me entirely now that the trash had been dealt with. Instead, he crouched. The movement was fluid, but the expensive fabric of his suit straining over thighs that were built for war. He reached out, his hand hovering near my face, large and calloused and incredibly warm. I flinched, a calculated move to sell the fragility, and a low rumble started in his chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression. It was a sound of deep, vibrating comfort, like a purr from a saber-toothed tiger. He whispered that I was safe now, his voice a rough velvet that scraped against my nerves in the most delicious way. He didn't wait for my permission. He slid one arm under my knees and the other behind my back, lifting me off the wet floor as effortlessly as if I were made of paper. I gasped, instinctively clutching at his lapels, my dirty, bleach-stained fingers digging into the immaculate dark wool of his jacket. I tried to protest, stammering that I was filthy, that I would ruin his suit, but he just pulled me closer, pressing my face into the crook of his neck. He smelled of rain-soaked earth and cedar, a scent so potent it made my head spin. For a split second, a spark of something hot and electric jumped between our skin, the undeniable friction of a bond trying to snap into place. I shoved it down, burying the sensation under layers of panic. He carried me past the bullies without even looking at them. As we passed, he simply murmured a single command to the empty air, instructing them to remain on their knees until he decided their fate. The terrifying part was that I knew they would. They would rot in this hallway before they disobeyed a direct order from a prime. We swept out into the cool night air, the heavy doors of the academy fading behind us. A sleek black vehicle idled at the curb, its engine purring like a beast in waiting. He didn't put me down to open the door. He managed it with one hand, depositing me gently onto leather seats that were softer than my mattress. He leaned in to buckle my seatbelt, his face inches from mine, his golden eyes scanning my features with an intensity that made me want to squirm. He checked the bruise forming on my arm, his jaw tightening, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He looked like he wanted to turn around and dismantle the school brick by brick. Instead, he slammed the door shut, locking me in the quiet, climate-controlled safety of his world. He rounded the car, sliding into the driver's seat, and the locks engaged with a decisive thud. He turned to me, his hand resting on the gear shift, and told me in no uncertain terms that I was coming home with him. Damon, that arguing would be a waste of my breath. Chapter 3. The Billion-Dollar Cage. The drive to the Obsidian estate was a blur of city lights stretching into the darkness of the private forest roads. I sat rigid in the passenger seat, gripping the door handle, watching the trees blur past. My mind was racing, calculating escape routes, estimating the distance to the border, and wondering if I could jump out of a moving car without breaking a leg. But every time I shifted, Damon's gaze flicked to me, heavy and possessive. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the console between us, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He treated the winding mountain roads with casual arrogance, the car responding to his touch like a well-trained animal. When the estate finally came into view, my breath hitched. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress of glass and dark stone, cantilevered over the edge of a waterfall. It looked cold, expensive, and impenetrable. This was the cage of a king. As the gates swung open silently, I realized that escaping from here wouldn't just be difficult. It would be a tactical nightmare. The car glided to a halt in a circular driveway that cost more than the town I was born in. Damon killed the engine, and the sudden silence of the forest rushed in, broken only by the distant roar of the water below. He was at my door before I could even unbuckle. I tried to scramble out, insisting that I could walk, that I wasn't an invalid, just a clumsy cleaner who got shoved. He ignored me completely. He leaned in, unclicked the belt, and scooped me up again. This time, I didn't fight the contact. I was exhausted, the adrenaline of the confrontation fading into a bone-deep weariness. I let my head rest against his shoulder, pretending to be the fragile thing he thought I was. He carried me through the massive front doors, into a foyer with ceilings so high they disappeared in the shadows. The floor was black marble, heated from beneath, contrasting sharply with the cold aesthetic of the walls. Staff appeared from nowhere, a butler, 2 maids. But Damon waved them off with a sharp jerk of his chin. He carried me up a floating staircase, his grip on me tightening, as if he thought I might evaporate if he let go. He brought me to a bedroom that was larger than the entire servants' quarters back at the academy. A fire was already crackling in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over a bed that looked like a cloud, and he set me down on the edge of the mattress, kneeling before me to unlace my dirty work boots. The act was so intimate, so shockingly servile for a king, that I froze. His large hands were gentle, peeling away the worn leather and the damp socks, inspecting my ankles for injuries I didn't have. He looked up, his face serious, and asked what I wanted to eat. He started listing options: imported steak, truffle risotto, delicacies that made my mouth water. But I knew my role. A poor cleaning girl wouldn't know what truffle risotto was. I shrank back, wrapping my arms around myself, and whispered that a grilled cheese would be fine. I saw the flash of confusion in his eyes, followed quickly by a softening that made my chest ache. He nodded solemnly, as if I had asked for the moon, and embarked an order into his phone for the chef to prepare the best grilled cheese in existence. The room was warm, too warm. The luxury was suffocating. Damon stood, pacing the length of the room, his energy restless. He kept looking at me, checking to see if I was still there, still whole. He told me the pack doctor was on his way to give me a full checkup. My blood ran cold. A checkup meant blood work. Blood work meant DNA. And DNA meant he would know within the hour that I wasn't Sienna the cleaner, but Sienna, the fugitive heir to the Western Warpack. Chapter 4: Medical Malpractice and Other Lies. The doctor arrived 10 minutes later, a nervous little man with wire-rimmed glasses and a scent that reeked of antiseptic and anxiety. He was clearly terrified of Damon, Saul, whose pacing had turned into a predatory stalk around the perimeter of the bed. I watched the doctor set up his kit on the bedside table, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The silver tray rattled as he laid out a stethoscope, a thermometer, and the object of my impending doom, a syringe. I couldn't let that needle touch my skin. If they ran my markers, the system would flag me instantly, and my father's hunters would be descending on this estate before sunrise. Damon stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed over his massive chest, watching the doctor's every move with hawk-like intensity. He growled low in his throat when the doctor asked me to roll up my sleeve. I did as I was told, my hands trembling, partly from the act, partly from genuine adrenaline. The doctor swabbed my arm with alcohol, yes, the cold wetness making me shiver. Damon stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. I needed a distraction. I needed chaos. As the doctor uncapped the needle, I let out a sharp, panicked gasp and jerked my arm back. It was a calculated flinch, timed perfectly to hit the doctor's elbow. The movement sent the silver tray clattering to the floor. Glass vials shattered. The syringe flew across the room. I buried my face in my hands, sobbing out apologies, shaking violently. Damon moved faster than I could track. In a heartbeat, he was between me and the doctor, shielding me from the threat of the spilled medical supplies. He snarled at the poor man, accusing him of being clumsy, of terrifying me, of being incompetent. The doctor, pale and shaking, scrambled to pick up the pieces, stammering apologies. Damon ordered him out, telling him to leave the antibiotics and painkillers, but to take his needles and get out of his sight. I peeked through my fingers, watching the doctor flee. Relief washed over me so continually, I almost felt dizzy. I had bought myself another day. Damon turned back to me, his expression shifting from rage to heartbreaking tenderness. He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under his weight. A maid had quietly left a tray of food on the nightstand during the chaos. Damon reached for the bowl of tomato soup and the grilled cheese, ignoring the utensils. He picked up the spoon, dipped it into the steaming red liquid, and brought it to his lips. He blew on it gently, his eyes locked on mine, checking the temperature with a seriousness that was almost comical. I tried to take the spoon, murmuring that I could feed myself. But he pulled it back, shaking his head. He told me to let him take care of me, just for tonight. There was something in his voice, a desperate need to be useful, to nurture, that silenced my protest. I opened my mouth, letting him feed me. The soup was rich and creamy, but it was the intimacy of the act that burned. Every time the spoon touched my lips, his gaze dropped to my mouth, dark and hungry. He set the empty bowl aside and reached out, his thumb brushing away a crumb from the corner of my lip. His skin was rough, calloused from fighting, but his touch was feather-light. A jolt of static electricity snapped between us, stronger this time. He froze, his hand lingering on my cheek. He leaned in, his nose grazing the sensitive skin below my ear. I held my breath. I had scrubbed my skin with industrial soap. I'd applied the scent-masking lotion and rolled in dust, but the heat of the room was making me sweat. He inhaled deeply, his chest expanding against my arm. He whispered that I smelled different now. He said I smelled like rain hidden under bleach. He pulled back just enough to look me in the eye, his pupils blown wide, swallowing the gold. He asked me what I was hiding. The question hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. I looked at him, my lips parted, knowing that one wrong word could shatter everything. I was on the precipice, and the Alpha King was waiting for me to fall. Chapter 5, Pretty Woman, Wolf Edition. If I thought the medical examination was an exercise in high-stakes anxiety, the shopping trip Damon orchestrated the next morning was a masterclass in mortification. He had decided, with the absolute, an unshakable confidence of a man who owned half the city, that my wardrobe was a personal insult to his pack's honor. Apparently, the oversized gray sweatpants I had slept in, which I had found quite comfortable, thank you very much, were unacceptable for a guest of the king. So, instead of plotting my escape or brewing a new batch of scent blocker, I found myself standing in the center of a boutique that smelled like crushed lavender and credit card debt, while Damon terrorized the sales staff. He didn't just shop, he conquered. He sat in a velvet armchair like a monarch on a throne, rejecting dresses with a single dismissive curl of his lip. The poor salesgirl, a beta with trembling hands, held up a beautiful emerald silk gown. Damon growled, actually growled, and said the color clashed with my eyes. He pointed at a rack of cashmere sweaters that probably cost more than a used sedan and ordered them in every neutral tone available. I stood there, clutching a price tag that had 4 zeros on it, feeling a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. This wasn't just generosity. It was a gilded cage being built around me, one silk scarf at a time. Every gift was a weight, a tether binding me to a man I was inevitably going to have to betray. I tried to intervene when he ordered a winter coat lined with actual fur. I stepped forward, putting my hand on his forearm, feeling the granite-hard muscle beneath his suit jacket. I whispered that it was too much, that I didn't need these things, that I was just a cleaner who would ruin them with bleach and dust. He looked at me, his expression softening from imperious warlord to something terrifyingly gentle. He covered my hand with his thumb tracing the prominent vein in my wrist, and told me that nothing was too much for the one under his protection. He said he wanted to wrap me in things that wouldn't scratch my skin, things that would keep me warm when he wasn't there to do it himself. The raw sincerity in his voice made my breath hitch. I was drowning in his care, and the worst part was I didn't want to swim to the surface. Then disaster struck in the form of a male mannequin. I had been staring at a display of lingerie, blushing furiously, when I felt a wave of killing intent roll off Damon. I turned to see him glaring at a plastic figure in a tuxedo that was positioned slightly toward the changing rooms. He muttered that he didn't like the way it was facing, as if the fiberglass doll was capable of peering through the curtains. It was ridiculous. It was insane. It was also, against my better judgment, charming in a dark, possessive way. But I couldn't let him buy the entire store. I needed to stop this. I feigned a stumble, pressing a hand to my forehead and letting my eyelids flutter. It was a cheap trick, one I had used to get out of boring court etiquette lessons years ago. I swayed, muttering about the heat, and pitched forward. Damon moved faster than thought. He caught me before I dipped an inch, pulling me against his chest, barking orders for water, for a chair, for everyone to back away. The salesgirl looked ready to faint herself. While he was distracted, fussing over my pulse, I glanced toward the large flat-screen TV mounting the wall above the register. The volume was muted, but the headline scrolling across the bottom was clear enough to stop my heart, for real. Western Warlord offers 50 million gold bounty for missing heir. My father's face, scarred and cruel, flashed on the screen, followed by a sketch of me. It was an old drawing from before I cut my hair, but the resemblance was there. Damon was busy threatening to sue the boutique for lack of air conditioning, but if he turned his head, if he looked up for even a second, the game was over. Chapter 6. Night Terrors and Cuddles. The nightmare was always the same. It started with the sound of heavy boots on stone, the specific, uneven rhythm of my father's gait. In the dream, I was back in the training pits, the sand hot and abrasive under my bare feet. And I was 12 years old again, holding a wooden practice sword that was too heavy for my arms. My father stood across from me, a towering shadow that blotted out the sun, telling me to strike him. When I hesitated, he didn't shout. He just laughed, and then the darkness would surge forward, not as a shadow, but as a pack of wolves with eyes like burning coals, tearing at my clothes, tearing at my secrets, exposing the weakness he despised so much. I woke up screaming. The sound ripped out of my throat before I could stop it. A raw, jagged noise that echoed off the high ceilings of the guest suite. I scrambled backward, tangling myself in the high thread count sheets, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The room was dark, but the door flew open with a force that nearly cracked the wood. Light from the hallway spilled in, for silhouetting a massive figure. Damon. He was shirtless, wearing only low-slung sweatpants, his chest heaving as if he had sprinted from the other side of the estate. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't turn on the lights or demand an explanation. He simply crossed the room in 3 long strides and vaulted onto the bed. He pulled me into his arms, burying my face against his bare shoulder. His skin was scorching hot, a stark contrast to the cold sweat clinging to my back. He smelled of sleep and musk, and that deep, earthy rain scent that seemed to settle my nervous system instantly. I sobbed into his skin, the terror of the dream bleeding away under the solidity of his presence. He rocked me, making low shushing noises, his large hand rubbing circles on my back. He murmured that he had me, that nothing could get past the door, that he would tear the throat out of anything that tried to hurt me. It was violent comfort, the kind only a predator could offer, and it was exactly what I needed. I clung to him, my fingers digging into the hard muscles of his back, feeling the steady, powerful thump of his heart against my cheek. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving, I was being held. Eventually, the adrenaline faded, leaving me exhausted. Damon shifted, maneuvering us so that I was lying down, but he didn't leave. He propped himself up against the headboard, pulling the duvet over me, positioning himself between me and the door. A silent sentinel. I watched him through half-lidded eyes, the moonlight catching the sharp planes of his face and the dusting of dark hair on his chest. He looked like a statue carved from war and worry. I drifted off, feeling safer than I had any right to be. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was streaming across the bed. I stretched, groggy and warm, only to realize my pillow was moving. I froze. I was draped across Damon's lap, my arm thrown over his stomach, my face pressed into his abs, and to my absolute horror, there was a small damp spot on his skin where my mouth had been. I had drooled on the Alpha King. I slowly, carefully tried to lift my head, praying he was still asleep. I tried to slide away, to retreat to the safety of the bathroom, and die of embarrassment. But a heavy arm tightened around my waist, pinning me in place. A low, sleepy growl vibrated through his chest, rumbling directly into my ear. His eyes were still closed, his breathing deep and even, but his grip was iron. "No," he rumbled, so the word thick with sleep and possessiveness. "Mine. Stay." Chapter 7. The Scent Mask. Failure. The comfort of the morning shattered the moment I stepped into the shower and realized the water smelled normal. My masking lotion, a volatile concoction of crushed herbs, chemical neutralize, and sheer desperation, was fading. I could smell the faint metallic tang of my own true scent bleeding through the cracks. Wildflowers and ozone, the scent of a storm-born alpha female. It was faint, barely a whisper, but to a nose as sensitive as Damon's, it would be a scream. I needed ingredients. I needed them now. I slipped out of the suite while Damon was in a council meeting, dodging the staff as I made my way to the estate's greenhouse. It was a massive glass structure filled with exotic flora, humid and thick with the smell of loam. And I scanned the rows frantically, looking for foxglove, heavy-petaled nightshade, or pungent mint, anything to brew a quick cover-up. My hands shook as I plucked leaves, stuffing them into the pockets of the oversized cardigan Damon had bought me. I found a patch of wolfsbane in the corner. Handled carefully, the toxin could numb the olfactory receptors, and reached for it. "I didn't take you for a gardener." The voice came from directly behind me. I jumped, spinning around to find Damon standing in the doorway, his suit jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked devastatingly casual and entirely too alert. I shoved my hands into my pockets, crushing the leaves, praying the sap wouldn't burn my skin. I forced a smile, my heart rate spiking. I lied, telling him I loved plants, and that I found the greenhouse soothing after the stress of the academy. It was a flimsy excuse, but he seemed to buy it. He walked toward me, the humidity of the room amplifying his own scent. He stopped close enough that I had to crane my neck to look at him. He looked at the dirt on my hands, then at my face. He seemed charmed by the idea of me pottering around in the dirt, seeing it as another sign of my gentle domestic nature. If only he knew I was currently holding enough poisonous material to knock out a horse. He stepped into my personal space, crowding me against a potting table. The air between us grew heavy, charged with that undeniable magnetic pull. He leaned down, his face approaching the crook of my neck, where the masking lotion was thinnest. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensing, preparing for the accusation. For the realization that I wasn't a beta mouse, but a wolf in disguise. He inhaled deeply, a long, slow drag of air that made my toes curl. He paused, his brow furrowing slightly. He didn't pull away. Instead, he pressed closer, his nose grazing my pulse point, his lips ghosting over the sensitive skin there. "You smell different today," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave, turning dark and contemplative. "Under the flowers, there's something sharp, something volatile." He pulled back just enough to lock eyes with me, his pupils blown wide, swallowing the gold irises. He didn't look angry. He looked intoxicated. He looked like a man who had just caught the scent of blood in the water and liked it. He traced the line of my jaw with his thumb, his gaze dropping to my lips. "You taste dangerous, Sienna," he whispered. And I think I'm losing my mind trying to figure out why. Chapter 8. The Training Ground. Damon decided that the best way to cure my fear of violence was to expose me to it in a controlled environment, which was male logic at its absolute finest. He brought me down to the training pits, a sprawling expanse of packed earth and sawdust, located behind the main house, surrounded by towering iron fences that screamed maximum security. The morning mist still clung to the ground, swirling around the ankles of the dozen or so shiftless warriors, warming up in the center ring. I sat on a bench, wrapped in the cashmere blanket Damon had insisted I needed, clutching a mug of tea like a lifeline. He wanted me to see that he could protect me, that his violence was a shield, not a weapon against me. And what he didn't know was that I had spent the last 10 years in the bloodiest fighting pits of the West, and the only thing terrifying me right now was how badly I wanted to jump the fence and correct his beta's footwork. Damon stripped off his shirt, revealing a landscape of muscle and old scars that made my mouth go dry for entirely unprofessional reasons. He moved with a lethal, fluid grace, stretching his arms above his head in a way that felt like a deliberate show for my benefit. His opponent was his second, a massive brute named Marcus who fought like a tank, all forward momentum and zero finesse. As they began to spar, the sound of flesh hitting flesh echoed off the estate walls. I watched, feigning wide-eyed apprehension, while internally, my wolf was critiquing every single move. Damon was fast, terrifyingly so, but he had a habit of dropping his guard on the left side when he went for a grapple. It was a microscopic error, one that a lesser wolf would miss, but a master assassin would exploit to bury a knife in his ribs. I flinched, not because I was scared, but because Marcus missed the opening for the third time in a row. My leg twitched under the blanket, my body aching to move, to flow through the forms I had mastered in secret. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, forcing myself to remain the fragile observer. Damon landed a sweeping kick that sent Marcus sprawling into the dirt, ending the match with a roar that shook the leaves off the nearby trees. He stood over his defeated second, chest heaving, sweat glistening on his skin like oil. He turned to me immediately, his golden eyes seeking approval, checking to see if I had run away in terror. He jogged over to the fence, radiating heat and pride, looking like a gladiator who had just won the Colosseum. He leaned against the railing, wiping his brow with a towel, and asked if I was okay. I nodded, gripping my tea, and told him that he didn't die. So it was a good morning. He laughed, a deep rumbling sound that vibrated in my own chest, and reached through the fence to tuck a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His knuckles grazed my cheek, leaving a smear of dirt and heat that felt like a brand. Marcus groaned from the ground, pushing himself up and spitting out a mouthful of bloody saliva. He looked at me, a playful glint in his black eye, and joked that maybe the little lady wanted to take a turn, seeing as she was watching so intently. Damon's playfulness vanished instantly. He spun around, a low, warning snarl ripping from his throat. He barked that I was not to be touched, not to be challenged, and certainly not to be involved in their brutality. He called me delicate. He called me soft. The words grated on my soul like sandpaper. My control slipped, just for a fraction of a second. I stood up, the blanket falling from my shoulders, and for one heartbeat, my eyes flashed a violent, radiant violet, the mark of a royal alpha. Marcus blinked, looking confused, but Damon's back was to me. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing the color back to brown, forcing my heart rate to slow. When I opened them, Damon was facing me again, his expression fierce and protective, completely unaware that the woman he was shielding could likely dismantle his entire guard without breaking a sweat. Chapter 9, Domestic Bliss and Frustration. The storm rolled in off the mountains that evening, a tempest of black clouds and horizontal rain that battered the estate like a siege weapon. The power grid, usually as reliable as the tides, surrendered around 8 o'clock, plunging the fortress of glass and stone into absolute darkness. Emergency generators kicked in for the security systems, but the main house was left in a heavy, intimate gloom. Damon, ever the provider, had lit dozens of beeswax candles, turning the living room into a flickering shrine of shadows and golden light. We sat on the rug in front of the fireplace, a board game called Empire spread out between us, the silence of the house amplified by the howling wind outside. It should have been cozy. It should have been sweet. Instead, it was a torture session of unresolved sexual tension. Damon was lying on his stomach, propped up on his elbows, the firelight dancing over the sharp planes of his face. He was staring at the board with the intensity of a general planning an invasion, plotting his next move to bankrupt my imaginary hotel chain. Every time he reached for the dice, his hand brushed mine. Every time he moved a piece, his scent, now heavy with the smell of the storm outside, washed over me, clouding my judgment. I wanted to climb him like a tree. My wolf was practically scratching at the back of my skull, demanding that I bite him, claim him, do something to break this unbearable restraint. But Damon treated me like I was made of porcelain. He moved his game piece with exaggerated gentleness, as if slamming it down might frighten me, and he asked if I was cold every 10 minutes. He offered to get me another blanket, more tea, a pillow for my elbow. It was infuriating. I was a warrior born of blood and fire, and the most powerful alpha in the North was treating me like a sick puppy. I decided to channel my frustration into the game. I ruthlessly acquired the most expensive properties on the board, leveraging my assets with a cold, calculated efficiency that made Damon pause. He looked up from the board, his eyes narrowing slightly, a flicker of suspicion warring with amusement. He tried to negotiate a trade using his alpha voice, that subtle, commanding undercurrent that usually made wolves roll over and show their bellies. It washed over me, a wave of compulsion designed to make me submit. I didn't even blink. I stared right back at him, smiled sweetly, and told him that unless he was offering his railroad and a get-out-of-jail-free card, he could keep his voice to himself. He froze. The command hadn't worked. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the candle flame reflected in his widening pupils. For a second he looked at me not as a charity case, but as a challenge. He shifted, rising from his prone position, to crawl toward me over the game board. The pieces scattered. He didn't care. He crowded me against the base of the sofa, his hands planting on either side of my hips, trapping me in a cage of his own body. The playful atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a hunger so raw it made my breath hitch. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine, his breathing ragged. He told me to stop looking at him like that, to stop looking at him as if I wanted him to devour me, asked because his control was hanging by a thread. I whispered a dare, asking him what would happen if the thread snapped. He groaned, a sound torn from his depths, and buried his face in my neck, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin there, promising a ruin I wasn't allowed to have yet. Chapter 10. The Strategist. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world scrubbed clean and bright, but the atmosphere in Damon's office was anything but sunny. Papers were strewn across every available surface. Maps of the borderlands, trade agreements, and stacks of legal documents that looked ancient and headache-inducing. Damon stood by the window, staring out at the forest, his shoulders tight with tension. He looked exhausted, the kind of weariness that comes from carrying the weight of 1,000 lives on your back. And I stood in the doorway with a tray of black coffee, watching him for a moment, my heart aching for the burden he refused to share. I walked in, setting the tray down on the mahogany desk, the china clinking softly. He turned, forcing a tired smile, thanking me for the coffee, as if I had just saved his life. I glanced down at the document spread open in the center of the chaos. It was a border treaty with the Southern Pack, a notorious group of encroachers who used legal loopholes to steal hunting grounds. I knew this treaty. My father had ranted about a similar clause for months. I scanned the dense, archaic text, my eyes snagging on paragraph 14, section C. It was a trap. The wording regarding seasonal river flow was ambiguous enough to allow the South to claim the entire valley during the spring thaw. I shouldn't have said anything. I should have poured the coffee and left. But seeing him so defeated, so outmaneuvered by a pen when he could win any war with a sword, made me reckless. I tapped the parchment with a fingernail, keeping my voice light. I casually mentioned that it was strange how the river rights were defined by the high water mark, considering the river shifted course 10 years ago. If he signed this, he would be giving away the Western Ridge by accident. Damon went still. He walked over to the desk slowly, looking from my finger to the map, then back to the text. He read the clause again, his lips moving silently as he parsed the legal trap. He looked up at me, and the expression on his face wasn't gratitude, it was shock. He asked me how I knew that. He asked me how a cleaner with no education, a girl who supposedly grew up on the streets, could decipher high lichen legal syntax and understand the geography of a border dispute 300 miles away. Panic flared in my chest, hot and sharp. I had slipped. I had let the mask fall. I forced a laugh, waving my hand dismissively, and spun a lie on the spot. I told him I read a lot of romance novels. I claimed that there was this one series, very steamy, very dramatic, where the hero was a magical lawyer, and they spent chapters arguing about river rights. I babbled, trying to fill the silence with nonsense, hoping he would buy the silly girl act one more time. Damon didn't laugh. He studied my face, searching for the lie, searching for the crack in the facade. He stepped closer, picking up the coffee cup, but not drinking, his eyes never leaving mine. He asked me, very quietly, on who taught me to read the old tongue, because they didn't teach that in romance novels, and they certainly didn't teach it in the public schools I claim to have attended. The air in the room grew heavy with suspicion, and for the first time I wondered if I had finally been too smart for my own good. Chapter 11. The Gala Invitation. The envelope sat on the mahogany desk like a loaded weapon, its cream-colored stock heavy and expensive, embossed with the silver crest of the Northern Territory. I stared at it, the steam from my tea curling into the air, while Damon paced the length of his office with the restless energy of a caged tiger. He had dropped the invitation between us casually, as if asking me to attend the annual Pack Gala wasn't the equivalent of painting a target on my back and inviting every hunter in the continent to take a shot. The gala wasn't just a party. It was a political summit where every alpha diplomat and spy gathered to trade secrets and assess weaknesses. And if I walked into that ballroom, I wouldn't just be Sienna the maid. I would be the most glaring anomaly in the room. Damon stopped pacing and turned to me, his hands buried in his pockets, the fabric of his suit straining across his shoulders. He didn't ask if I wanted to go, he simply stated it as an inevitability. He told me that he was tired of hiding me away in the estate like a shameful secret, that he wanted to show the pack who their king had chosen to protect. His voice was low and rough, with a sincerity that made my chest ache. He thought I was hesitating because of my station, because I felt unworthy of the silk and the spotlight. He didn't know I was hesitating because my father's spies were undoubtedly on the guest list, sniffing around for a runaway heir with a bounty on her head. I tried to play the insecurity card, whispering that I didn't belong there, that I didn't know which fork to use, that I would embarrass him in front of his council. I hunched my shoulders, making myself look small, pulling the sleeves of my sweater over my hands. Damon crossed the room in 2 strides, closing the distance until I had to crane my neck to look up at him. He reached out, tilting my chin up with a gentle finger, forcing me to meet his golden gaze. He told me that I wasn't a maid in his eyes, that I had more grace in my little finger than the entire High Council combined. The conviction in his tone was terrifying. He was falling for the lie, and every sweet word was another brick in the wall of guilt I was building around us. Later that afternoon, the dress arrived, along with a pair of heels that looked like torture devices designed by an architect. I put them on in the safety of the bedroom, testing my balance. I had run across rooftops in combat boots and danced at royal balls in stilettos since I was 16. Walking in these was as natural as breathing. But when Damon knocked on the door to check on me, I remembered my role. I opened the door and immediately wobbled, throwing my arms out in a pantomime of clumsiness. He caught me instantly, his arm wrapping around my waist, pulling me flush against his chest. I looked up at him, feigning breathless embarrassment. But my internal radar was screaming. In my stumble, my elbow had knocked a heavy crystal vase off the entry table. My reflex took over before my brain could stop it. My hand shot out, snatching the vase out of mid-air inches before it hit the floor. It was a move of pure, honed instinct, too fast, too precise for a clumsy girl. I froze, holding the crystal, and saw Damon's eyes widen. He looked from my hand to my face, the calculations starting to tick behind his gaze. Panic surged. I opened my fingers, letting the vase drop the final inch. It shattered with a spectacular crash. I gasped, covering my mouth, apologizing profusely for being such a disaster. Damon stared at the shards, then back at me, his expression unreadable, before he slowly told me it was just glass. But as I turned to look out the window to hide my face, I saw it. A black SUV with tinted windows, idling just beyond the estate gates. The sharks were circling. Chapter 12. The Wolf in the Blue Dress. The dress was a weapon of mass distraction. It was a midnight blue velvet sheath that hugged every curve I had regained over the last month. Slit up the thigh high enough to make a priest blush, with a neckline that plunged dangerously low. I stood in front of the full-length mirror, smoothing the fabric over my hips, acknowledging that for tonight, I wasn't just hiding. I was hiding in plain sight. If I was going to walk into the lion's den, I was going to do it looking like I owned the place. When I stepped out into the hallway, Damon was waiting. He was adjusting his cufflinks, looking devastating in a tuxedo that fit him like a second skin. He looked up, and his hands went still. The air left his lungs in a sharp, audible exhale. He didn't say a word. He walked toward me with a slow, predatory intent that made my knees weak for real this time. He stopped a breath away, his eyes raking over me, burning a path wherever they lingered. He reached out, his knuckles grazing the bare skin of my shoulder, and whispered that I looked dangerous. The irony almost made me laugh. He offered me his arm, his muscles tense beneath the fine wool, and told me to stay close. He wasn't just escorting a date, he was guarding a treasure. We took the town car to the grand hall, his hand never leaving my thigh during the drive, his thumb tracing soothing circles that did absolutely nothing to calm the riot in my blood. The ballroom was a sea of diamonds, silk, and judgment. As we made our entrance, the conversation died instantly. Silence rippled outward from the doors until the only sound was the click of my heels on the marble. I felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes on us. I heard the whispers start, low and venomous. They called me the stray, the charity case, the king's pet. I felt Damon stiffen beside me, a low growl vibrating in his chest that only I could hear. He pulled me closer, his arm locking around my waist in a possessive claim that silenced the nearest group of gossiping matrons. He was challenging them to say it to his face. He was protecting me from their words, unaware that I had endured worse insults from my own father before breakfast. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne, and I grabbed a flute with a little too much enthusiasm. My nerves were frayed wires, sparking with every perceived threat. I downed the expensive vintage in one unladylike gulp, the bubbles burning my throat. I needed the liquid courage. I scanned the room over the rim of the empty glass, my eyes darting from face to face, analyzing threats. That's when I saw him. A man in a nondescript gray suit, standing near the orchestra, watching not the crowd, but me. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't smiling. He was hunting. Damon leaned down to whisper something in my ear, a joke to make me smile, to ease the tension he thought I was feeling. I tried to listen, I tried to focus on the warmth of his breath against my skin, but the man in the gray suit began to move. He cut through the crowd with efficient, silent steps. I turned to Damon, my hand gripping his lapel, ready to beg him to take me home, to feign a migraine, anything to get out of here. But it was too late. A heavy hand clamped onto my bare shoulder from behind, the fingers digging in with a familiarity that made my blood run cold. A voice, dry and devoid of mercy, spoke close to my ear. "Found you, princess. Your father sends his regards." Chapter 13. The Confrontation. The music didn't stop, and the chatter of the gala continued around us, a surreal backdrop to the nightmare unfolding at my back. The title princess hung in the air between us like a curse. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I knew that voice. It belonged to Kalen, my father's most efficient tracker. A man who had dragged me back to the Western compound 3 times before. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't alone. Damon reacted before I could even draw a breath. He didn't know who Kalen was, but he knew another male had touched his mate. Damon spun around, breaking Kalen's grip on my shoulder with a violent shove that sent the tracker stumbling back a step. The Alpha King placed himself between us, a wall of pure, unadulterated rage. He snarled, a sound that finally cut through the ambient noise of the party, causing the nearby guests to gasp and recoil. He demanded to know who dared to touch his guest, his voice booming with the authority of a ruler on his own soil. Kalen straightened his suit jacket, unbothered, his eyes cold and dead as he looked up at the towering Alpha. He didn't bow. He didn't apologize. He simply smiled a thin, cruel smile. Kalen raised his voice, pitching it perfectly so that it carried over the hush of the crowd. He announced that he wasn't touching a guest. He was retrieving stolen property. He pointed a finger at me, peering around Damon's bulk. He told the room, told Damon, that the woman cowering behind the king wasn't a destitute cleaner named Sienna. She was the High Lady Sienna, heir to the Western Warpack, fugitive from her betrothal, and a liar of the highest order. The accusation hit Damon like a physical blow. He froze, his aggressive stance faltering for a fraction of a second. He turned his head slowly to look at me, confusion warring with the fury in his golden eyes. He whispered my name, but it was a question now. He asked if it was true. He looked at the woman he had fed soup to, the woman he had carried, the woman he thought would break if he held her too tight. I opened my mouth to explain, to beg him to understand that I lied to survive, not to hurt him, but the betrayal in his eyes silenced me. He looked at me like he didn't know me, and in that moment of hesitation, the trap sprung. Kalen signaled. 3 more men in gray suits materialized from the crowd, moving with military precision. They didn't go for me. They went for Damon. They tackled the Alpha King, 3 heavy bodies slamming into him at once, using the element of surprise to bring him to one knee. Damon roared, throwing one off. But they were elites, trained to subdue alphas. While Damon was distracted, Kalen moved. He grabbed me, spinning me around and pulling my back against his chest. I felt the cold, sharp bite of a steel blade press against the soft skin of my throat. The room erupted into screams. Damon threw the last guard off and scrambled to his feet, chest heaving, ready to kill. But he stopped dead when he saw the knife. Kalen tightened his grip, the blade digging in, drawing a single bead of blood. He told the king to stand down, or the fragile girl would bleed out on the ballroom floor. Chapter 14. The Glass Shatters. The blade pressed against my skin was cold, a biting contrast to the feverish heat of the ballroom. But it was the look on Damon's face that truly cut me. He stood frozen across the polished floor, his chest heaving, his hands held up in a gesture of surrender that looked completely alien on a man built for war. He was terrified. Not for himself, despite the 3 elite guards circling him, But for me, he saw a trembling, helpless maid about to be slaughtered, a fragile thing he had failed to protect. And the sheer devastation in his eyes broke something inside me, snapping the final tether of my restraint. I had spent months making myself small, shrinking my soul to fit into the shadows, but I refused to let the man I loved bow to a coward like Kalen just to save a lie. I stopped trembling. The change was instantaneous. A switch flipped deep in my marrow, where the wolf slept. I grounded my heels into the marble, feeling the ley lines of the earth humming beneath the foundation. Kalen, arrogant and blind to the shift in my posture, tightened his grip, his breath hot and rancid against my ear as he taunted the king. He didn't notice that my pulse had slowed to a rhythmic predatory thrum. He didn't notice that the air pressure in the room had dropped, sucking the breath from the lungs of the guests nearby. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, apologizing silently to the girl I had pretended to be, and then I opened them. The soft brown contact lenses dissolved under the surge of my power, revealing the radiant, violent violet of a royal alpha. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I simply spoke, pitching my voice into the command frequency that forces every shifter within a mile radius to obey or suffer. I said, "Let go." The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. The crystal chandeliers overhead exploded, raining shards of glass down like glitter. The floor-to-ceiling windows along the eastern wall shattered outward, unable to contain the sudden expansion of my aura. Kalen didn't just release me, he was blasted backward, as if hit by a freight train. He flew 10 feet through the air, I crashing into the banquet table in an explosion of silverware and expensive appetizers, the knife clattering uselessly to the floor. The silence that followed was deafening, heavier than the chaos. The 3 guards who had been wrestling Damon were on their knees, forced down by the sheer weight of my dominance. Guests were pressed against the walls, clutching their chests, their wolves whining in submission. I stood alone in the center of the circle of broken glass, the velvet of my midnight blue dress untouched by the debris. I calmly reached up, adjusting the strap that had slipped during the scuffle, and brushed a speck of dust from my bodice. My hands were steady, my chin was high, the mouse was dead. The lioness had finally come out to play. I turned slowly to face the wreckage of the buffet table. Kalen was groaning, trying to push himself up from a pile of ruined roast beef. I didn't give him the chance. I lifted a hand, palm open, and with a mere flick of my wrist, I pinned him back down, using nothing but telekinetic pressure. He wheezed, his eyes bulging, as he finally looked at me, really looked at me, and saw the monster he had foolishly tried to leash. "Tell my father," I said, my voice smooth and terrifyingly calm, "that if he sends another tracker into my territory, I will mail them back to him in pieces. Do you understand?" He nodded frantically, unable to speak against the force crushing his windpipe. I released him, and he scrambled backward, fleeing the hall without a backward glance. Only then did I turn to Damon. The air around us was still crackling with static electricity, the scent of a storm so potent it tasted like metal on the tongue. And I expected anger. I expected him to be furious that I had deceived him, that the fragile girl he had been nursing was a lie. I braced myself for his rejection, my heart hammering against my ribs, not from fear, but from the terrifying vulnerability of being seen. But Damon wasn't looking at the destruction. He wasn't looking at the fleeing guards. He was staring at me, his golden eyes wide and unblinking, tracking the violet glow of my irises. He took a slow, dazed step forward, ignoring the glass crunching under his dress shoes. He didn't look betrayed. He looked like a man who had been worshipping the moon his entire life and had just seen it crash into the earth right in front of him. "You," he breathed, the word barely audible over the ringing in my ears. "You're an alpha." Chapter 15. The Silent Drive. The drive back to the estate was a masterclass in suffocating tension. The silence inside the armored SUV wasn't empty. It was pressurized, heavy enough to crush a lesser wolf's lungs. Damon drove with a lethal focus, his knuckles white against the leather steering wheel, the engine growling low and aggressive as we tore through the winding forest roads. He didn't look at me once. He stared straight ahead, his jaw locked so tight I could see a muscle feathering beneath the skin of his cheek. I sat in the passenger seat, no longer huddled against the door like a frightened mouse. I sat tall, my spine straight, the velvet of my dress pooling around my legs like spilled ink. The violet glow had faded from my eyes, returning to brown, but the energy humming under my skin was still very much alive. And I wasn't the girl he had rescued from a hallway puddle anymore. I was the woman who had just flattened a room full of elite assassins without breaking a sweat. And the shift in our dynamic was terrified and exhilarating. When we pulled up to the glass-fronted fortress of his home, he killed the engine but didn't move to open my door. For the first time in weeks, the Alpha King let me handle myself. I unbuckled my own seatbelt, the click loud in the quiet cabin, and stepped out into the cool night air. I didn't wait for him. I marched up the stone steps, my heels clicking a sharp, authoritative rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. I heard the car door slam behind me, followed by heavy, rapid footsteps eating up the distance between us. I braced myself. The storm was about to break. We burst into the foyer, the heavy front door slamming shut with a finality that shook the crystal chandelier overhead. Damon spun me around, not roughly, but with a desperate intensity that bordered on madness. He looked wild, his tie undone, his hair disheveled from the fight, his chest heaving. He stared at me as if he were trying to reconcile two completely different people in his head. The fragile cleaner he had nursed with soup and blankets, and the powerhouse who had just telekinetically thrown a grown man across a banquet hall. He roared my name, the sound echoing off the high ceilings, demanding answers that I knew would only hurt him. He accused me of playing him. He paced the room like a caged animal, gesturing wildly as he listed my crimes. He threw my clumsiness in my face, my supposed poverty, the way I had let him carry me up the stairs because I was too weak to walk. He shouted that he had treated me like spun sugar, terrified that a strong wind would shatter me, while all along I was a weapon forged in the fiercest fires of the West. His anger wasn't born of malice. It was born of embarrassment. The great Alpha King, the protector of the realm, had been coddling a warlord's daughter who could probably take him in a fair fight. I didn't shrink away. I didn't apologize. I matched his energy, stepping into his space until we were toe-to-toe, breathing the same charged air. I shouted back that I hadn't asked to be coddled. I told him I had asked for safety, for a place to hide from a father who wanted to sell me like cattle, and he was the one who decided I was made of glass. I poked a finger into his hard chest, I emphasizing every word. I told him I let him carry me because it was the first time in my life anyone had offered to hold me without asking for my power in return. I admitted that I loved his protection, not because I needed it, but because he gave it freely. He stopped pacing. He looked down at me, his eyes searching mine, the gold burning brighter than I had ever seen it. He asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, incredulous whisper, if I had been laughing at him the whole time. He asked if I found it funny, watching the big bad Alpha fret over a scratch on my arm while I was sitting on enough power to level a city block. I shook my head, my throat tight. I told him the truth. I told him that I was terrified the moment he saw my strength, he would stop seeing me. Then the humor of the situation hit me. A sudden spark in the middle of the fire. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that, for the record, his concern was sweet but unnecessary, considering I could bench press him if I really wanted to. Damon froze. The anger in his face fractured, replaced by a look of sheer, stunned confusion that quickly darkened into something much hotter. He blinked, processing the words. He repeated them slowly, asking if I had just claimed I could bench press the King of the North. The air in the room shifted instantly. The static charge of conflict twisting into a suffocating, undeniable lust. The distance between us vanished. He stepped forward, forcing me to back up until my shoulders hit the wall. He planted his hands on either side of my head, trapping me, his body a wall of heat and muscle. He leaned down, his lips brushing against my ear. His voice a low, rough growl that vibrated straight through my bones. He told me to stop talking and start showing. He challenged me to prove that I wasn't the fragile little thing he had saved. He dared me to show him exactly how much I could handle. Chapter 16. Mating the Queen. The dare hung in the air between us, heavy and intoxicating, vibrating with a challenge that stripped away the last remnants of the frightened girl I had pretended to be. I didn't back down. I reached up, grabbing the lapels of his ruined tuxedo, and yanked him down to my level, crashing my mouth against his. It wasn't a tentative kiss, and it certainly wasn't the chaste, protective peck of a guardian comforting his ward. It was a collision of galaxies, a hungry, desperate claiming that tasted of adrenaline and months of suppressed desire. For the first time, I didn't hold back my strength. I kissed him with the full force of a royal alpha, nipping at his lip hard enough to draw a drop of blood, demanding he meet me not as a savior, but as a mate. Damon groaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated against my chest and swept me up into his arms. This time he didn't cradle me like I was made of spun glass. His grip was iron tight, his fingers digging into my hips with a possessive urgency that told me the gloves were off. He carried me into the bedroom, kicking the door shut with a force that shook the paintings on the walls. We didn't make it to the bed immediately. We stumbled, tangled together, shedding clothes and armor in a frantic trail across the floor. When my back finally hit the mattress, he followed me down, his weight a grounding comfort that I welcomed with every fiber of my being. He hovered over me, his golden eyes burning with a mixture of awe and raw hunger. He traced the line of my jaw, his touch no longer hesitant, but reverent. He whispered that he had spent weeks terrified he would crush me, only to find out I was the only thing in his world strong enough to bear his weight. The confession broke me open. I pulled him down, wrapping my legs around his waist, arching into his touch. The friction of skin on skin was electric, a storm finally breaking after a long suffocating drought. There was no need for words, no need for gentle pacing. We moved together with a frantic, perfect rhythm, two predators circling, testing, and finally succumbing to the inevitable gravity of the bond. When the moment came, it was primitive and absolute. I felt his canines graze the sensitive junction of my neck, the spot that had been aching for him since the moment he walked into that hallway. I bared my throat, surrendering not out of weakness, but out of trust. He bit down, breaking the skin, and the world exploded into white-hot light. The mating bond snapped into place like a steel cable, tethering our souls together with a force that stole the breath from my lungs. It wasn't just physical, it was a psychic avalanche. I gasped as his mind flooded into mine. I felt his crushing loneliness, his overwhelming sense of duty, and beneath it all a love for me so profound it terrified me. And he felt me. He saw the fear of my father, the shame of running, and the fierce, unyielding pride that had kept me alive. We lay there for a long time afterward, limbs tangled in the sheets, and the room cooling around us. The silence was different now. It wasn't heavy or filled with secrets. It was the comfortable, settled silence of home. Damon traced patterns on my bare arm, his head resting on my chest, listening to the steady rhythm of my heart. He chuckled softly, the sound rumbling through me. I asked him what was so funny, my voice rasping with exhaustion. He propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at me with a lazy, satisfied grin that made my toes curl all over again. He pointed out that technically, since I was now the queen of the Northern Territory and his mated partner, My employment contract as a cleaner was null and void. I laughed, swatting his arm, and told him I was actually quite good at the floors, and it would be a shame to waste my talent. He shook his head, kissing the tip of my nose. Arnon told me that queens didn't scrub floors. They hired the cleaners. He promised to get me a staff of my own, provided I promised never to hide my strength from him again. I smiled, tracing the mating mark on his neck that mirrored my own, and told him it was a deal. But the peace was shattered a second later. The silence of the room was cut by the shrill, jarring ring of the landline on the bedside table. We both froze. No one called that line. It was an encrypted channel reserved for emergencies and high-level threats. Damon sat up, the playfulness vanishing from his face, replaced by the hard mask of the king. He reached out and snatched the receiver, putting it to his ear without a word. I watched his eyes narrow, his jaw tightening as he listened. He didn't speak for a long moment, but the air in the room grew cold. He looked at me, his gaze dark and serious, and held the phone out. He told me it was for me. It was my father. Chapter 17. The New Regime. The receiver felt heavy in my hand, a black plastic anchor dragging me back to a life I had outrun. My father's voice crackled on the line, demanding, imperious, and utterly devoid of warmth. He spoke of duty, of bloodlines, and of the army he would bring to burn the North to ash if his property wasn't returned. For a heartbeat, I was 12 years old again, standing in the sandpits, trembling under his shadow. But then I felt a large, warm hand cover mine. Damon didn't pull the phone away. He simply leaned in, his cheek pressing against my temple, and spoke directly into the microphone. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the casing and straight into my marrow. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply informed the Warlord of the West that he was welcome to try, but warned him that stepping 1 foot across the border would mean facing not one alpha, but 2. He told my father that his daughter was no longer a runaway heir. She was the Queen of the North, and she had a pack that would die before they let her go. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then, with a sharp click, the connection died. My father, a man who had never backed down from a fight in his life, had hung up. The relief that washed over me was so profound my knees actually buckled. Damon caught me, of course. He always caught me. He pulled me into his chest, burying his face in my hair, and for a long moment, we just breathed. The specter of the past dissolving in the morning light. He kissed the top of my head and whispered that it was done. The cage was open. The hunters were gone. All that was left was to tell the world who I really was. An hour later, we stood before the double-glass doors leading to the main balcony of the estate. Below us, the entire pack had assembled. Hundreds of wolves standing in the manicured gardens, their faces turned upward in anticipation. I smoothed the skirt of the fresh dress I had changed into, a simple white silk that felt light as air, and felt a flutter of nerves. Damon offered me his arm, his golden eyes filled with a pride that made me feel 10 feet tall. We stepped out together into the cool morning air. The roar that went up from the crowd was physical, a wall of sound that shook the stone beneath our feet. Damon didn't step in front of me to shield me this time. He stood beside me, shoulder to shoulder, presenting me not as his prize, but as his equal. I scanned the sea of faces, my enhanced vision picking out details with razor-sharp clarity. I saw the awe, the curiosity, and the respect. And then near the front row, I saw them, Braden and Jessa. The bullies who had terrorized me for months looked like they were about to vomit from sheer terror. They were bowing so low their noses were practically touching the grass, trembling visibly. A bubble of dark, delighted laughter rose in my chest. I couldn't help myself. I lifted my hand in a small, regal wave, locking eyes with Jessa as she dared to peek up. She went pale as a sheet and dropped back down, forehead to the dirt. It was petty, It was childish. It was absolutely delicious. When the address was over, Damon led me not back inside, but down the side stairs toward the private training gardens. He had a glint in his eye that I hadn't seen before. Mischievous, challenging, and incredibly hot. He pulled off his tie, tossing it onto a bench, and rolled up his sleeves, revealing those forearms that had been the subject of my fantasies for weeks. He turned to me grinning and told me that since I had claimed I could bench press him, he wanted a demonstration. He wanted to see the warrior I had been hiding. He wanted to see his queen fight. I didn't hesitate. I kicked off my shoes, sinking my bare toes into the cool grass. I fell into a defensive stance, the muscle memory of 1,000 fights flooding back. Damon lunged, not with full force, but with enough speed to test me. I dodged, weaving under his arm, and landed a playful palm strike to his ribs. He laughed. I spinning to catch me, and for the next 10 minutes we danced. It was a language of motion, a conversation of blocks and parries and breathless laughter. He was strong, devastatingly so. But he had that one fatal flaw I had noticed weeks ago. He overextended on a right hook. I saw the opening. I dropped low, hooking my leg behind his ankle in a perfect sweep. Gravity took over. The Alpha King, the most feared predator in the north, went down like a sack of potatoes. I was on him instantly, straddling his waist, pinning his wrists to the grass above his head. He stared up at me, his chest heaving, his eyes dark with arousal and delight. He didn't look defeated. He looked like he had just won the lottery. He pulled his hands free, not to throw me off, but to cut my face, pulling me down until our lips were an inch apart. And he whispered that I was the most dangerous thing he had ever let into his house. And he planned on keeping me forever. I smiled against his mouth, closing the distance, and told him that was good, because I wasn't going anywhere. This was my pack now. This was my mate. And I was finally, truly, home. And just like that, the mouse didn't just survive the trap. She bought the whole house. If seeing Sienna finally put Damon on his back, literally, gave you butterflies, do me a huge favor and hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that we want more queens who can fight their own battles. If you're not part of the library yet, don't leave the pack now. Subscribe and turn on the bell. The next alpha is already waiting in the wings, and trust me, he's even more possessive than Damon. And I want to hear from you in the comments. What was your favorite moment? The spicy soup scene, or the moment the glass shattered at the gala? And don't forget to tell me where you're listening from today. I love seeing our pack spread all over the world. Until next time, keep your standards high and your fences higher. I'll see you in the next story.